Countries have occasionally expressed dissatisfaction with the United Nations, leading to threats or attempts to leave the organization. However, no nation has fully withdrawn. One notable case is Indonesia in 1965, which declared its departure due to a dispute over Malaysia's seat on the UN Security Council. However, the UN never formally recognized Indonesia's withdrawal, and the country resumed participation in 1966 under a new government. In 2016, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte also threatened to leave the UN after the organization criticized his administration's handling of the war on drugs. He accused the UN of meddling in domestic affairs but ultimately did not follow through with the threat. In the United States, proposals to withdraw from the UN have surfaced several times, especially among isolationist or unilateralist political groups. For example, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, introduced in 2017, sought to terminate U.S. membership in the UN. Though it gained some political support, such proposals have consistently failed to pass due to the potential diplomatic fallout and the influence of multilateralism on U.S. foreign policy. Countries in the BRICS alliance, along with a growing number of nations from the Global South, are intensifying their calls for sweeping reforms at the United Nations. They argue that the organization is disproportionately influenced by Western powers, particularly through the UN Security Council, where 5 permanent members, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, hold veto power. The BRICS bloc, representing over 40% of the world's population and nearly 25% of global GDP, has long contended that this structure is outdated. Meanwhile, 54 African countries, which account for about 28% of UN membership, have no permanent representation on the Security Council. Critics point to the fact that Western nations control over 60% of voting power in key global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, further marginalizing emerging economies. This imbalance, they argue, undermines efforts to create a truly representative global governance system. In recent years, countries like India and Brazil have advocated for expanding the Security Council to include permanent seats for large developing nations. This proposal has gained traction but faces stiff resistance from Western powers. Perceived Western bias and double standards are frequently cited by BRICS countries, who accuse global organizations, including the United Nations, of favoring Western nations in decision-making and enforcement. This imbalance is often highlighted in the area of human rights. Countries like Russia and China, both BRICS members, regularly face international scrutiny for their domestic policies, such as Russia's treatment of LGBTQ+ individuals or China's actions in Tibet and Xinjiang. However, they argue that similar issues within Western countries receive less attention. For instance, while Russia is routinely condemned, human rights abuses or discrimination in Western nations, like racial profiling or mistreatment of indigenous populations, do not face the same level of global condemnation. In the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, similar inconsistencies are evident. While international condemnation was swift and widespread following Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians, the response to Israel's retaliatory measures, including the use of white phosphorus and the blockade of essential supplies in Gaza, has been more subdued. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have criticized these actions as potential war crimes, but the international community's response has been far less forceful, again raising concerns at double standards in global humanitarian efforts. A glaring example of this double standard is Europe's treatment of refugees. The European Union's swift and robust support for Ukrainian refugees, who have been granted extensive rights such as access to work, education, and healthcare, contrasts sharply with the treatment of refugees from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. During the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, many European nations erected physical barriers and imposed stricter asylum policies, often citing security concerns. As a result, many refugees from these regions continue to live in overcrowded camps or under challenging conditions in countries like Turkey and Lebanon. The disparity in treatment has led critics to argue that identity, including race and religion, plays a significant role in how refugees are received, with Ukrainian refugees, who are predominantly white and Christian, seen as more culturally aligned with Europe. The battle for influence remains a familiar grievance for the BRICS bloc. A major concern is the dominance of Western nations in global institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank, and United Nations. These organizations, crafted in the aftermath of the Second World War, reflect the geopolitical realities of a bygone era when Europe and the United States exerted substantial sway. However, the balance of economic power has shifted dramatically. Emerging giants such as China, now the world's second-largest economy, and India, with its population overtaking China's, argue that their influence remains underrepresented in these bodies. Nowhere is this imbalance more evident than at the IMF, where the long-standing arrangement of an American heading the World Bank and a European leading the IMF remains intact, frustrating emerging markets. Though BRICS nations collectively account for nearly 25% of global GDP, their combined voting power at the IMF hovers closer to 15%. China, despite its $18 trillion economy, holds less than 7% of voting rights. Calls for recalibrating voting structures have been persistent, but progress has been sluggish and mostly symbolic. Geopolitical friction also contributes to tensions between BRICS members and the West. Russia, increasingly isolated by Western sanctions following its invasion of Ukraine, has deepened ties within the bloc. China, too, finds itself at odds with the West over its policies in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the South China Sea. These geopolitical rivalries have reinforced BRICS's push to reform global governance structures they perceive as biased. Sanctions on Russian businesses and individuals have not only hurt Moscow but also caused ripple effects in global energy markets, disproportionately affecting developing nations reliant on Russian commodities. At the IMF, the lack of meaningful change in voting power allocation fuels discontent. China's outsized economic stature, with its GDP surpassing $14 trillion in 2020, remains inadequately reflected within the institution. Emerging economies argue that this institutional lag entrenches the inequities between the global North and South. Climate policy is another contentious issue. BRICS nations argue that Western-led climate initiatives place disproportionate burdens on developing countries, many of which are still industrializing. While the West has historically been the primary contributor to global emissions, emerging economies are often expected to adopt ambitious emission targets without receiving adequate financial or technological support. India, for instance, has emphasized that any transition to green energy must not come at the cost of economic growth, particularly in a country where coal still plays a vital role in the energy mix. Trade policies exacerbate these tensions. Western agricultural subsidies, particularly in the European Union and the United States, are frequently criticized for distorting global markets and undercutting farmers in developing countries. BRICS nations, whose economies rely heavily on agriculture, argue that these subsidies create unfair competition, further widening the gap between rich and poor nations. As BRICS nations continue to push for a more equitable global order, various proposals have been made to reform the United Nations and other international institutions. One idea is expanding the UN Security Council to include permanent seats for countries like India and Brazil, reflecting the multipolar world we now live in. Another proposal advocates for strengthening regional organizations, such as ASEAN or the African Union, to enable localized governance structures better equipped to handle regional crises. With the recent expansion to BRICS+, incorporating nations such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the bloc's share of global economic power continues to rise. If reforms within established institutions remain elusive, the group's efforts to create alternatives could reshape the global governance landscape, diminishing the relevance of the Western-led order. Yet, even among BRICS members, internal challenges persist, ranging from political differences to conflicting economic priorities. How effectively the bloc overcomes these hurdles will largely determine whether it can fulfill its vision of a more balanced global system. Thank you for watching this video. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today. If our content resonated with you or sparked inspiration, please consider expressing your support by liking it and subscribing to stay connected with our community. Your support holds immense value for us. You can watch another video on our channel, which is now on the screen.